team at Naughty Dog had a difficult task ahead of them in creating The Last of Us Part 2. How do you follow up on one of the most loved and critically acclaimed games of a generation, retaining the spirit and emotional impact of that game while avoiding common tropes and telling an interesting, unpredictable tale that elaborates and builds on everything that came before? Well, for our part, we think that's exactly what they achieved. Here's a spoiler-free rundown of everything we loved about The Last of Us Part 2.
I am wearing boots today. You know how you're gonna die?
Ooh, let me guess. You're gonna kill me? Did I ruin your punchline?
No. Maybe. Fuck you.
Let's get right down to it. The Last of Us Part 2 is, narratively, one of the most well-crafted games I've ever played. Pre-launch, the game was subject to leaks that detailed a few key scenes. It's not only fair to say that context is extremely important in understanding these cutscenes, it's also worth noting that that context is, in fact, the entire point of the game.
You remember me? You remember me.
It's kind of difficult to speak at length about how the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is crafted without risking major spoilers. But know that it's a game that dives deeply into some complex human emotions. Just as the first game was about the unconditional love of a parent and what people are willing to do in the name of that love, Part 2 looks at a similar angle through a different lens. If we can love someone no matter what, and put them above everything else in our lives, can we also cling to blind hatred, even when it would arguably serve us better to look towards the light? On a very basic level, The Last of Us Part 2 is a revenge story. But that description, together with what some people on the internet think they know about the game, is frustratingly reductive. Yet, to dive into what that means would be to risk spoilers, and this is a story you should experience for yourselves. So, as a primer, this game takes place about 5 years after the events of the first. Joel and Ellie have settled into a somewhat peaceful existence within the community of Jackson. With its twinkling lights, frontier-style hub, salt-of-the-earth citizens, and huge walls to protect it from any outside threats, infected or otherwise, it seems like Jackson has a good thing going. There's some subtle tension bubbling between Joel and Ellie, but there's also a blossoming romantic relationship forming between Ellie and Dina, another young Jackson inhabitant. The early hours of the game show how Jackson has afforded Joel and Ellie a level of normality almost comparable to our own, an illusion only shattered by the regular patrols the citizens of Jackson take part in to keep the vast surrounding area free and clear of clickers. But there are parties, there are friendships, and there's a lovely mini story arc of Ellie and Joel bonding over guitar playing that is surprisingly interactive.
Thanks.
And yet, unsurprisingly, it doesn't last. A tragic event upends this quiet life and sends Ellie spiraling into a blind search for justice that leads her away from Jackson and into the harsh, wider world. Luckily, and as we all know by now, Ellie is a survivor. She's faster, nimbler, and smaller than most people she encounters, and so is able to go toe-to-toe with aggressors, ducking and weaving away from their attacks while waiting for an opening for the killing blow. She's still proficient with a bow and arrow and a wide range of firearms, tapping into lessons taught to her by Joel to upgrade her weapons at suspiciously plentiful workbenches, while also scavenging items like alcohol, rags, blades, and adhesives to craft health kits, makeshift silencers, trap bombs, and Molotov cocktails, with recipes you'll find as you explore.
Okay.
As much as she can hold her own though, she is frequently outnumbered by enemies just as smart as she is, who work together to outflank and outmaneuver her. In many instances, if you're spotted, it's best to simply run away and wait until you can again use stealth to your advantage. Thankfully, the world of The Last of Us Part 2 is so big, it easily allows this. There's almost always more than one route forward that you can take. And now that Ellie can jump and climb, and use ropes to swing and scale walls and steep inclines, there's much more scope to sneak, track, and slip by enemies, rather than face them head on. A dedicated prone button also means she can crawl through long grass or under cars and bits of debris to avoid detection. Though lying motionless in a patch of grass doesn't afford you the same level of invisibility it does in other games. It's a bit more believable in that respect. And staying in one spot for too long isn't recommended anyway, especially when dogs are involved, as they'll sniff you out and give away your location in an instant. As with the previous game, listen mode really is your most crucial tool for gaining the upper hand in almost any situation, whether you're hiding from a human faction who are actively trying to flush you out, or you're trying to quietly bypass a nest of infected without stirring them up.
Over here! By the fence! Smoke her out! Go, go, go! You're done!
This being now 25 years after the initial outbreak, infected are naturally even less widespread than they were in The Last of Us Part 1. I mean, that's not to say you won't bump into plenty, particularly when you're travelling through an enclosed space that hasn't been disturbed in some time, but it's clear there are far bigger dangers in this world now. Still, there are a few surprises in the form of new, evolved types of infected, including the Shambler, a huge, hulking, heavily armoured monstrosity that explodes into clouds of toxic gas whenever it gets close. This kind of infrequent use of infected is of course nothing particularly new, but it's even more important here in Part 2 to ensure they never lose their ability to terrify. And they don't. Their variety certainly helps to keep you on your toes. Runners are manageable in isolation, but can quickly become deadly when a crowd turns their attention on you. Clickers are blind, but give away your position and it's insta-death. Getting through an infestation in one piece always necessitates an amount of strategy, meaning you'll feel that tension on your 20th encounter just the same as you did on your first. But really, even with some much appreciated additions to streamline traversal and combat and make Ellie feel that bit more empowered, much of the gameplay in The Last of Us Part 2 is a case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That said, some of the control choices, mapping multiple opposing functions to the same button for example, makes things feel a little bit more clumsy than they ought to. Too many times you'll be stealthily trying to swap or reload a gun, only to find Ellie standing up and swinging her melee weapon into the air instead. It's by no means a deal breaker, it's just the kind of awkwardness you'd have expected developer Naughty Dog to have ironed out by now. But what the game lacks in perfect control scheme, it more than makes up in absolutely stunning spectacle. This really is the PS4 going out on a high.
Hey, how far away are we? A few minutes out. Okay.
Easy.
It's difficult to review a game you believe has one of the most emotionally complex and nuanced narratives of recent times without being able to go into any real detail on that story. But The Last of Us Part 2, as we mentioned before, is a tale of revenge, and yet it's so much more than that too. It's a uniquely woven story about trauma, about empathy, about redemption. It asks some uncomfortable questions of us as players. It shows how, as people, we're capable of selfless love and hideous, all-consuming hate. It gives space to LGBTQ+ stories without it feeling like lip service or a box-ticking exercise. It has moments of beautiful tenderness and brutal, almost overwhelming violence. Yet, in my opinion at least, it's justified. It never lets that violence go unchecked, without also considering the trauma that it inflicts. It shows violence, but it also recontextualizes it, showing how, if unchecked, a quest for revenge and bloodthirsty obsession with getting even can destroy everything it touches. It's a cruel world that shaped Ellie into the person she is, but that cruel, uncaring edge is tempered by softer, more personal relationships, beautifully portrayed by a strong cast and very natural, understated dialogue. And that's, of course, very well supported by staggeringly sophisticated performance capture that can allow so much of the character's communication to be non-verbal and hugely emotive.
Okay, that's good. Here I go.
Want to grab some breakfast?
This isn't your average gaming power fantasy. It tears down the notion of heroes and villains. It makes you feel shame and disgust at your actions. It shows you different sides to people you consider enemies, at a point when it's too late to take back what you've already done. At times, it's not an easy ride, but it doesn't want to be easy and it doesn't want players to be too comfortable. Instead, it challenges you with a story you won't soon forget, and that risk pays off in the long run. It's something we need more of in games. A tale that isn't just comfort food, but tries to elicit more difficult emotions in its players. Once the credits roll, you'll still be thinking of The Last of Us Part 2 for some time to come. We'll be diving into some heavy spoilers in later videos, as well as sharing endgame secrets from our chat with Neil Druckmann. So make sure to subscribe to Eurogamer if you haven't already, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever our daily video goes live. Until then, you can clicker on one of the videos on screen now. Thanks for watching. Bye!
Yeah, this route has its perks. Where do we sign in? Come on. Fuck.